This is the Doc and Krueger Cast, the official podcast of Doc and Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 0, Doc and Krueger. Hello, friends, and welcome to this very first episode, I guess the 0th episode or something.
The precursor episode.
Yes, the introduction, as it were, to the Doc and Krueger cast. I'm Chris Krueger, and I'm joined by Adam and Doc Brackin.
Hey, everybody.
And we wanted to sort of take this opportunity to welcome you to the show, to explain what it is that we're doing with it, and the direction that it will be going as we continue to create games.
Yes, that is a thing that we are going to do.
Indeed it is. The whole idea behind this is that, for me personally, I find that I enjoy exploring a lot of new role-playing game systems as they come out or ones that are introduced to me by friends. And I'll be very excited to, say, run something or to play something, but I don't always have the time to sit down and read through the rulebook, unfortunately.
That's a good point, yes.
A lot of times when I do sit down to read the rulebook, it's like the night of, and I'm very rushed, and
that is a terrible idea.
Yes. It's a very, very bad idea, but unfortunately, real life does get in the way. But I do have a lot of time during the day where I'm driving or I'm, walking or doing some other sort of exercise or something like that. And there's just like a lot of empty space in which I can do stuff like listen to podcasts, which I've gotten really into the habit of doing over the past couple of years.
Yes, and you've sucked me into that world too, so thank you.
You're welcome. But yeah, like lots of audiobooks, and I actually am a big fan of a couple of podcasts that haven't really put out a lot of new content recently, but I still really enjoy Master Plan by Ryan Macklin and Narrative Control by Sean Nittner. Those are two specifically role-playing game podcasts, more about kind of the development and the playing of role-playing games. So kind of inspired by that and inspired by just the fact that I find that I have a lot more time to listen to books than I have to read them. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if there was some way to learn about a game that just came out on a podcast? And so that's why we're doing what we're doing here. We decided that we are going to sort of read you the rules, help you to understand the game that way. If you want to sort of either review the rules or kind of listen through them and then maybe go back and review in the book later, to kind of have some commentary about how we like to play the game, some tips and tricks and that sort of stuff. And then beyond the games themselves, talk a little bit about other games that we enjoy, where we take some of our inspiration, and then also just sort of wax philosophical about tabletop RPGs and maybe other tabletop games in general.
Yeah, so lots of different approaches. You could take this completely non-linearly if you wanted to, sort of cherry pick the stuff, because every episode's going to be a little bit different within 3 or 4 different categories. So I'm really excited about this. This is going to be fun.
But we also want to take this opportunity to kind of introduce ourselves. And so, Doc, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background in gaming and in games academia?
Yeah. I actually fell into gaming in a weird sort of way. Doc is more than a nickname, and it's not just because I'm hairy. That's a dwarf joke, by the way. It actually has to do with the fact that I have a PhD in humanities, aesthetic studies, with a focus in art and technology from the University of Texas at Dallas. That's a mouthful. So what that actually means is that I studied nonlinearity in terms of narrative. So I am actually a storyteller first, and I am a game creator as an extension of my own personal philosophy. I actually created a number of alternate reality games, and my dissertation was all about Deus City, which if you actually still, try to find the top 10 alternate reality games before they died a slow and horrible death, you can find that Deus City is, depending on who you ask, still considered one of the top 10. So I'm deeply honored by that. I think that's super cool. That's a year of my life that my wife will never get back. And I would never trade it. It was amazing. And I did a few other small projects. Actually, I've even done some, let's call it ghostwriting in that space, stuff that I'm still under an NDA and not able to talk about, which is mysterious and fun. But what I really, really like doing is telling collaborative storytelling, nonlinear stories, especially visualizations with nonlinear. And that's the research that I did while I was a university professor at the University of Texas at Dallas. And worked on some projects there and was able to do some really cool things with video games and the video games, let's call it department that they have there. So I am deeply honored to be a part of that world and to have been able to publish and present a few papers at Oxford and some things like that. If you actually look for the Brackin model of authenticity or authenticity model, you'll find a couple of different applications of that model and that theory. And one of them is video games, as well as one might expect, alternate reality games. So, I love transmedia. I love transmedia worlds. I love all of that stuff rolled up into a ball, thrown at the wall, and seeing what kind of oozes down it. Is that enough of a visual metaphor for you? Is that good?
Yeah, I'm trying to get the image out of my head now, actually.
Okay, well, yeah. So, that's what I do, and what I like to do. So it makes perfect sense that I have a huge draw towards role-playing games, especially heavily, I don't want to insult the mechanics of it and misrepresent, but call them heavily narrative-driven ones. And I actually think that if you design them right, you can make it so that the mechanics themselves lead into the narrative itself, but that's a bit spoilery for what's coming up, because that's sort of the core philosophy of Doc Krueger Games.
Indeed. Yep. And my background is also a little bit academic. I actually got my Bachelor of Arts and my Master of Fine Arts from the University of Texas at Dallas.
It's where we met.
Both of which were in arts and technology. And I focused on game studies, game design, with a very sort of narrative interest, I should say. A lot of my perspective was very narrative in nature. I didn't minor in creative writing, but I took a number of creative writing courses. I tried to generally have like a nice, well-rounded sort of look at the humanities. So a bit of training in art and design, a lot of writing and literature and some philosophy and all that sort of fun stuff.
I'm nodding, by the way. I know that doesn't come through on a podcast, yes. But
for those of you not benefiting from the video feed.
Yeah, there you go. Wait, video feed? Where's the camera?
I didn't tell you about that.
Oh, okay.
As you said, Doc, we did meet in a couple of your classes. You were the professor and I was the student as a lowly little sophomore.
Those were the days.
Learning the basics of video game design.
Yeah, but if you mash the fast forward button, then we find him as a professor of his own right, as a TA.
Yeah, TA and RA.
Assisting in my classes. We actually, I would go ahead and say co-taught a class in the role-playing game, history and development of the role-playing game. Couldn't have done it without you. So,
thank you.
Those experiences, I think, were foundational in us discovering that we had a similar philosophy.
Yeah.
And, that's the reason why we decided Doc Krueger needed to be a thing.
Mm-hmm. Both of us have a history in playing role-playing games. Doc, I think you've been playing them for a lot longer than I have.
Yeah, that's because I'm a lot older than you are.
Well, I think you got an earlier start, too, age-wise. I actually didn't really get started playing them until I took your class as an undergrad on the history and development of role-playing games.
That's true. That's true.
Which then I later helped to teach. But that was actually my introduction to tabletop RPGs. And it was funny because I went into it thinking, because I was at the time wanting to become a video game developer. And so I thought this was going to be about video game RPGs, like Final Fantasy and all that sort of stuff.
We spent a week on that.
Yeah, I suppose it was touched on, yes. But it wasn't what I was expecting. And I actually found that I was very intrigued by the player-driven nature of tabletop RPGs.
That's right.
The fact that your stories are open-ended and that you can kind of make it whatever you want it to be, that the rules aren't so set in stone that you can't kind of break them a little bit when the story would be served by breaking the rules.
Exactly.
And so got an introduction through that to a little bit of Dungeons and Dragons, to the Serenity role-playing game, run in Cortex.
Classic Cortex, yes.
And then, of course, Burning Wheel, which is still one of my favorite games ever since then.
Yeah, me too.
And then we, I think you were the advisor for, and I was one of the officers for the Strategy Game Club at UTD.
Yes.
Which was kind of where we all met. I forget if it was weekly or bi-weekly.
Oh, no, it was every week.
It was every week, yeah.
Yeah.
And people would just meet to play different board games and sometimes role-playing games. And so I remember we had this pretty epic year-long Lord of the Rings campaign that we ran in Burning Wheel.
Yeah, we did.
That was pretty awesome.
We did. It was set in the Second Age, a prequel.
That was a lot of fun. So having sort of studied tabletop role-playing games and getting a chance to play them together, we kind of got a sense that we had a very similar philosophy in how we played and what sort of games we like and how to design them. At one point while I was in grad school, I think it was my last year of grad school, actually, we decided to team up and do a Kickstarter for a game that we call Genre.
Yes, we did.
And so that is a game that actually we do still plan to release. It's been very much delayed. Unfortunately, the Kickstarter didn't fund, but it was a really great experience sort of getting into that world and learning about crowdfunding, and we actually got halfway there, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, it was great.
So we ran that Kickstarter and designed a game that way, and that's when we came up with the Doc and Krueger moniker. But we want to kind of continue and start not just being in the tabletop, board game space, but also in the tabletop role playing space.
Exactly.
Because for different classes and stuff like that, came up with a couple of original systems, and we've kind of bounced around ideas for other systems beyond those. So one of those is actually called Mind, which is short for Murder Your Darlings. There's an N there between your and darlings.
And it's MYND, you see.
Yes.
It's very clever.
And the idea behind that one, it's actually, without going too much into it now, because we'll sort of explore the background of that when we eventually release it, it's kind of been this very long process of lots of interesting failures that have led up to where we have it now.
Yeah. Failing forward is one of the core philosophies of all of our games.
Indeed.
And also our development process.
So it was actually originally my big semester-long project for that undergrad tabletop RPG class.
That's right.
That I sort of scrapped but took some of the core philosophy of it and translated into another system, which is never going to see the light of day.
Never publish your first draft of anything.
Nope.
Ever.
And then I scrapped that one and came up with this other idea, which was sort of the beginnings of what Mind is now. But then I scrapped that and now have something a little bit more solid. But
my actual job is just to make him actually publish a thing instead of scrapping it and moving on to something else.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what I do.
So that's what we're doing now. And that got real. If I had to share sort of the core philosophy of what Mind is, it's basically trying to make storytelling the core of the system, not just a result of what you do around the system.
Yeah, as a mechanic itself, in other words. Yeah.
It's basically, I think the way I phrased it at one point is what I learned in creative writing class, the game.
Mm-hmm. I remember that. Yeah, that's funny.
Everything is based on, scenes rather than individual actions. Mm-hmm. It's based on kind of the mechanics are actually more about the narrative significance of something than it is about your skill level with something.
Yes.
So you have complete narrative freedom to tell the story however you want, but the direction of the story is kind of guided by the mechanics that will sort of auto adjust the narrative tension depending on how well or how poorly you've been doing, along a number of different conflicts, which sort of help to guide your story arcs. There's a lot of stuff that's in there to help guide character development and stuff like that.
And I'll take credit for having at least helped in seeding some of those ideas. Just because my own work and theories and that sort of thing has a lot to do with visualizations and what it means whenever you have an X over Y dynamic, and where, X is time and Y is narrative tension. And we actually wrote some grants and pitched a few things during my time at UTD about this idea of what would a procedurally generated story look like. And so a lot of those ideas have actually been translated over into an analog space. Instead of having a computer do it, we're having humans do it, where the mechanic itself becomes the dice and multiple die types. And so I absolutely love where that system is and where it's going to be whenever we get to season 2.
Yep. So look forward to that. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is because it actually greatly informed our first game that we're going to be talking about this season, which is the Roll With It system.
Yes,
so,
diceless.
While I was still in grad school, a group of me and 3 other grad students, one of whom dropped before we actually got the podcast rolling proper, but he was very instrumental in kind of coming up with our initial direction. We wanted to sort of have a podcast where we talked about games from an academic perspective.
Now, you're not talking about the Doc and Krueger cast, right?
No, I'm not. I'm talking about the Backward Compatible podcast.
I've heard of that one. I may actually be a co-host.
Yes, you are. And you actually joined a few months into that podcast.
I did. I sure did.
So you weren't one of the founders, but you very quickly joined us.
Hey, I seem to remember 4 guys being shoved into my very tiny office going, hey, we're going to start a podcast.
Yeah, we kind of pitched the idea by you, and you gave us some advice on where we might be able to take it.
And I was a guest a few times. I was there in spirit.
Yep.
There in spirit.
You were always around, and then you were officially there a few months into it.
Come on, guys. Let me be in your podcast. Come on.
Come on. And so now you, me, and our other co-host, Jim Weaver, are the hosts of this podcast where we talk about games and new media with a splash of academia.
That's right.
And one of the things we decided to do early on as well was to make a spin-off podcast, because we would very frequently get together and play role-playing games. Why not record it and kind of do a little sort of actual play podcast?
Why not?
But the idea was always It wasn't so much to try to like feature different systems. And there are a lot of really great actual play podcasts out there that I'm a big fan of. I've listened to a whole bunch of them. And we wanted to do something a little bit different. In fact, we actually kind of had the idea before I got into those, which is kind of funny. But we wanted to first and foremost tell improvised stories where we were just using the role-playing games as kind of the structure for that.
Exactly.
So it was more almost like, we thought of it almost more as like an improv show than we thought of it as a role-playing game show. with some production value and things like that thrown in. Mm-hmm. So that show was called Roll With It, ROLE with it, because we were being punny. We did our first season using Primetime Adventures, which is actually a pretty big influence for this game, Roll With It. It is.
I would actually call it a modified Primetime Adventures because we sort of ignored some of the rules on purpose.
Mm-hmm. Because when we played it,
when we played it, because we were focusing on the story over the mechanics for that podcast.
Mm-hmm. We even did stuff where we would cut out certain things about like, we wouldn't have you hear the entire process of us revealing who wins the scene.
Yeah, we just skip straight to the story stuff.
Yeah, we just go. So we have a little bit of that wherever it kind of like seems relevant.
Yeah.
But we never make the mechanics the focus. It's always about the story.
Yeah. Well, and there's a reason for that that's very logical. And it's that we, the players sitting around the table, can get into the crunchy bits and have lots of fun doing it because we have the agency. But once you then carry that over into audience is not experiencing that. And so that can slow it down. And you can be like, come on, guys, just get on with the story. Mm-hmm. And so that was always our goal with that. And that's interesting because then that ties in to the Roll With It system that we've created, which is that we wanted to make it so that would happen for the player too, or the mechanics were almost so integrated as to not even need describing of this is what I rolled or this is what I had, or that you can just with a quick glance know and move on with the story.
Yep.
And I think that we've succeeded at that, but more about that later.
Yep, you can be the judge of that. So yeah, we're not going to talk too much about the Roll With It system right now, but that's kind of a little bit of background on how it came to be.
Yeah.
And a lot of those same philosophies from Mind tied into. We sort of found that Mind defined a lot of our core philosophies as designers that are going to inform a lot of what we have in Roll With It, and also a lot of the games are going to be coming up in the future.
Yeah, if you've not checked out the Eden program, which was our first season of that, go check that out. That's a lot of fun. We've gotten some compliments on it. That was fun to do for sure. And then, check out some of our other seasons after that too.
So to give you sort of a sneak peek into what we're going to be doing next episode and throughout the season, this first episode of the podcast is going to be kind of what we're calling the audio rule book for the Roll With It system. We're not going to read the entire rule book. There are a few things that we've left out intentionally because it's going to be a little bit of a living document. So for example, when we talk about the sort of additional tips and tricks, that's going to be evolving over time as we start getting more feedback and we come up with new things that we want to talk about. We might add an FAQ section at some point as we get questions from the players. But we do cover all of the core rules. We left out some of the examples of play because we pulled examples from season 4 of Roll With It, which is kind of our debut of the Roll With It system on our show.
Yeah, it's so cool.
So if you wanted to go and listen to that season, you might get a little bit of a sense of how it works in action. But we're also going to be, if you go back and read the examples in the book, there's a few explanations of how things were working mechanically in the background that might not have made it into that final cut. But for the purpose of this podcast, we're going to be basically just going through the rules and then letting the extra stuff, as it were, come out through our sort of commentary episodes they're going to follow. So after this one, we're going to have some stuff where we talk about character creation best practices, things like how to sort of play the card game strategically. That's kind of like how to play the mechanical side of the Roll With It system. And then other sort of tips and tricks like that. So it's going to be very conversational after this first one.
Right.
And a lot of that stuff that we're going to be talking about is going to be also addressed somewhere in the book, but some might be bonus content. So
yeah. Well, if we have succeeded in doing what we really wanted to do here, I think we've done something nobody else has done. And that's to create a rule set for an RPG that we're releasing as an ebook, but also as an audiobook. And then also, as the creators, creating an entire season of our own podcast to explain what we did, why we did it, what our inspiration was, and then also having a show which is separate from that, which is actual play using that system. And all of that together is, I think, going to be this sort of 4-part harmony of unlike anything that we've quite seen before. So we're going to let you be the judge as to whether or not you like the system, but we're very, very proud of the way that we have brought it to you.
I won't argue with that. So thank you for joining us for season 1, episode 0 of the Doc and Krueger cast, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah.
The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Brackin and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll With It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.